Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Estermann, and I'm heading EUA's work on governance, funding, and public policy development. And I'm delighted to moderate today's webinar on greening and environmental sustainability and how universities can lead this major transformation into the next decade. I'm delighted that my two colleagues, Henriette Stoeber and Luisa Bunescu, will share the main results of a survey we've done earlier last year on greening. And this will be in the first part of this webinar, and in the second part, you will also have the possibility to ask some questions and also provide some comments. You will have the possibility to do this in the Q&A session, but of course you can also share other comments in the chat. But for questions, please use the Q&A session. I would also like to point out that this webinar is part of the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference as a side event that takes place this week in Barcelona in Spain, an event that aims at reshaping ideas and practices in higher education to ensure a sustainable development of our planet and our societies. So we're glad that we are part of this major event. Now, before I hand over to my colleagues, just a few words on why this topic is of such high importance to EUA and universities in general. The climate crisis and particularly sustainability more broadly are urgent issues that have led many universities to put their missions in education, research and innovation and culture into the service of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are also many policy initiatives like the European Green Deal or the Next Generation EU program that actually have as a main focus the green transition. And by the way, on those two topics, EUA has also done some work. Just very recently, we've published the sector's view on the Green Deal and how universities can actually contribute to their achievement. And on the other hand, what's needed for them to manage this. The climate crisis is also one of the 6 challenges that we have identified in our strategy for universities that universities have to tackle. And this vision document sets out 3 elements for the future of universities for the next 10 years. And one of them is that, of the headlines, is that universities are going to be sustainable, diverse, and engaged. And it also sets out that the green transformation touches on learning and teaching, on research and innovation, on mobility, on international collaboration, and on processes within the institution, and of course also on the campus itself. So it's really something that is cross-cutting topic for universities. So that's why EUA has conducted a survey in 2021, and you will find the results and related reports also in the handouts if you are interested in more details. And we had a very great response rate from our membership. Almost 400 institutions responded to this survey and gave us the possibility to provide the sort of state of play of greening at universities and how they lead this transformation. And I will hand over to my colleague Henriette to share some of those findings with us. Just to introduce Henriette, she has been with EUA for quite a while and has been leading EUA's work also on higher education policy, particularly on data collection related to the trends reports that many of you know, but also on refugees and also on this greening topic where she has coordinated the survey. So Henriette, please, share some of these highlights from this survey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas, for the introduction. And I will jump right into it then and show you some of the examples of the survey that we ran in 2021. And I'll try to link some of the more specific details to the context of the World Higher Education Conference, namely items that perhaps connect nicely to internationalization activities of the universities. So first of all, I'm happy to report that a vast majority of our universities taking part in the survey really address the topic of environmental sustainability quite strategically. You can see here on the left-hand side of the slide that at the time of data collection, 61% had a strategy in place, and in another quarter or so, this was currently under preparation. When looking into how these strategies were framed, there was actually various options. The most frequent that we saw was that universities actually had a dedicated sustainability strategy, so addressing all of the SDGs overall, which also referenced environmental sustainabilities. But there were also quite a number of cases where environmental sustainability and greening were actually linked in the core strategic documents of the university. Other cases also include universities with dedicated greening strategies, so it's a bit of a mix indeed. Here on the slide, you see a graph, and this is a question where we asked the universities which policy documents or frameworks are you linking and explicitly highlighting in your university strategies. And very obviously, you see here from the bar chart, the SDGs are the leading policy document addressed by university strategic documents far before national policies or European policies, which get references only in some cases. I would like to especially highlight the item towards the bottom of the graph here, and that's the EU Green Deal. Now, when we ran the survey a bit more than a year ago, I think, the Green Deal was a year old at the time. And actually, we did think that 16% already referencing it in their strategic documents was at the time already quite a large number. And I think if we ran this survey question again today, this number would have grown considerably, and it will do so in the future as well. Right. Now, one of the main aims of our survey was really to gather information on the activities, on what is going on at the university level in terms of greening and environmental sustainability. And I would like to invite you all to have a look at our report, which really gives details across various areas and missions of the university and how they relate to environmental sustainability. Just to name a couple of examples here that you can see on the slide. So for instance, we do see a number of activities in the area of research and innovation. As an example here, reducing the environmental footprint of laboratory research. A quarter of universities have comprehensive policies in place to do so. And 54% of universities say they have at least some activities to reduce the footprints of their research in laboratories at their institution. At the bottom, another example which relates to greening the campus, and we do see a number of activities there as well. The perhaps most obvious one would be recycling and waste management. And depending on how you see it, only or already 68% of universities have a concrete, comprehensive policy in place when it comes to recycling. The remainder of the universities said that they at least have some activities in place. So, all of the universities clicked either one of those options there. Okay, now, as promised, I wanted to highlight a couple of areas that might be of interest to the audience of the World Higher Education Conference. And I would like to start with international partnerships. I apologize for the very small graph. I hope it is readable. I would like you to focus on the line in the middle in light green, which is the sum of the different options. And you can see here that when it comes to environmental sustainability, 86% of universities actually partner up with other universities on this specific topic. So they run projects or other kind of partnerships specifically dedicated to environmental sustainability. Further down then on the graph, the second highlighted box that you see here, also more than 80% of universities actually said that they partner up with employers and enterprises or with NGOs in at least some activities when it comes to environmental sustainability. And this really shows that aspects of sustainability can become central to partnerships, national or international partnerships. And when we think about this in the international scale, one could frame this or relate this to knowledge diplomacy. So where transnational collaboration between universities can be a powerful enabler indeed for transformation towards more sustainable societies, but also towards more sustainable universities across the globe. Of course, when we talk about international universities, we cannot forget or we cannot skip the topic of mobility. Again, a very large graph. I will just highlight the areas in yellow here, and I will focus mostly on the dark green bars. Those are the areas where universities have standard procedures or compulsory measures in place with regards to the options selected here. The first box on the top that you see there is provision of digital tools for teleworking, teleconferencing, and virtual mobility. No surprise there, after COVID-19, more than half of universities have this in place as standard for their students and staff when it comes to teleconferencing or virtual mobility. Sticking then with virtual mobility, the box in the middle is all about virtual mobility as a replacement for physical mobility for either staff or for students. You can see here in both cases, a quarter or more of the universities actually nowadays have it standard have standard procedures or measures in place where virtual mobility can indeed replace physical mobility. At the very bottom of the graph, this is mobility in the wider sense, so to say. This is all about low carbon forms of transportation coming to the campus, coming to meetings and so on. And you can see here also, at least 10% have standard measures in place, but this area is not as developed as virtual mobility is at the moment. Okay. My last graph here that I wanted to highlight is the area of learning and teaching. We thought that this was particularly interesting, actually. We were quite surprised by the number of activities going on with regards to learning and teaching and environmental sustainability. The first area that you see highlighted here on the graph is with regards to considering environmental sustainability or sustainability overall in curricular reform. And you can see here that more than 60% of the universities actually consider the SDGs in their curriculum reform, which is quite a large number indeed. The topic of SDGs is also referenced in all or most study programs at 53% of universities nowadays. So again, quite a large number. And I think this might also be growing in the future as well. So my final words then, we have this leading question today, how universities can lead the major transformation towards environmental sustainability. And I think my answer to this one would be, well, they already do in a way. We at EUA, we believe that universities can be key actors, aren't actually not only can be, they are key actors in a transition towards carbon neutrality. I think our report and survey data has shown that they have a lot of activities that potentially can contribute to the goals of the SDGs, but also towards the goals of the Green Deal and so on. And their activities cover basically all of their missions from research to education. And this also, we see this as an area that is growing in the future. How can they do it even better? How can they contribute even better? Well, I think it is all about strategies. It is all about addressing the topic strategically and really involving all the stakeholders. So we've seen good practices, or let's say successful practices, especially in those cases where universities involved actors from students and staff, but then also having the strategic element. So that's it from me now, and I'm looking forward to my colleague's presentation and then also the discussion and your questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Henriette. And I think this sort of introduction already triggers some questions. I can already see people wanting to hear some more details as well, which certainly we will cover then later in the discussion. Now, it's a pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Luisa, who, as a short introduction, is, among other things at the moment, leading our work on leadership and transformation with a big project that we're running at the moment called New Lead. But Luisa has also been working on our areas of funding. Our public funding observatory reports that some of you might know. And she will look now at some of the aspects of connecting this topic to funding, leadership, and governance. So over to you, Luisa, for also a first introduction on that angle.
Thank you, Thomas, for the kind introduction, and hello everyone from my side as well. Henriette presented the key results of the survey that we at EUA conducted in 2021. So what we further did with the results was to basically look at 4 main dimensions in order to further analyze greening and sustainability. So we looked at what this means in terms of funding, then what this means in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, then in terms of procurement, and in terms of leadership and governance at universities. And what I would like to do now is to briefly walk you through these 4 dimensions and tell you what we found out. In terms of funding, perhaps as you might expect, the key challenge to address greening and sustainability at universities remains general underfunding. So there are not enough financial resources for universities to properly dedicate themselves to this mission as well. This is not surprising, so to say, especially in a context of declining levels of public funding for universities and for the higher education sectors in parts of Europe. There are still systems in Europe that when it comes to investment for higher education, they have not yet returned to pre-2008 levels of investment. Now, this challenge is further exacerbated by the fact that greening initiatives become particularly difficult, especially as they required substantial upfront investment. For instance, when it comes to building green and having major changes in terms of energy efficiency and campus infrastructure in general. And of course, it should be said that the COVID-19 pandemic has not helped from this point of view, and that funds, they had to be reshuffled to more urgent priorities. And so greening and sustainability, once again, they were, so to say, left a bit on the side. And that is why the key message here in terms of funding is that we really need adequate investment, both at national and European levels, so as such investment to act as enablers for future advancement of greening activities at universities. In terms of European funding, we have the European Green Deal. However, the calls there would have to be catered so that universities can also apply for grants. And then we have the Next Generation EU, the post-pandemic recovery facility that is open to EU member states. And we have seen how some systems put in their national recovery and resilience plans projects for greening and sustainability of their public universities, but perhaps more on this later on. In our report that you can consult as it is part of the handouts of this webinar, we also refer to various funding instruments that could be used in order to advance a greening and sustainability agenda in higher education in Europe. So you can work with, for instance, performance-based funding indicators or performance contracts within which certain targets between the government and universities can be agreed when it comes to greening. The performance contracts would have the advantage that they allow for individualization and flexibility in such joint targets to be agreed upon. Then one could also think, for instance, of a budget for green measures at the national level. It could be made up of grants for universities, but any other instruments such as loans for universities, like at favorable interest rates, that universities that would like to carry on a green investment should be equally considered. Now, a couple of words on the next dimension, which is efficiency and effectiveness. Of course, because of the pressures on the university finances, most universities, according to our survey respondents, seem to be aware of the economic benefits that greening and sustainability bring for the institution. In the slide that is now displayed, you could see that 64% of the respondents agreed that their institutional activities around greening brought them some cost saving, whereas almost a quarter said that this was not the case yet, but they expect it to be in the future. And I think this is an important point to make here. Greening and greening activities should not be analyzed in the short term. The returns on investment for greening activities tend to come in the medium to long term. We have consulted various papers researching this, and pretty much all experts in the field said that it takes under 10 years to have a return on investment from going green, for instance, through energy savings and water savings. Although building green, and this is really a point that I would like to emphasize, although it is generally associated with higher upfront costs, because you would have to put in more money at the very beginning of the project, then if you look at the entire building life cycle, then you would have a return on investment. Also, what should be equally considered in addition to building green are measures such as asset sharing and sharing services, not only within the institution, in this case, not only within the university, but also between various organizations. And in the report, you could see several examples of universities that either shared resources among themselves or within their own faculties and departments, and how this led to cost savings. Then a couple of words on procurement, which tends to be perceived as a mere technical tool. In fact, when you look at the purchasing power of the collective purchasing power of universities in Europe, you realize that they are very important economic actors in their communities and ecosystems. Research shows that in Europe, about 10 to 15% of the annual operational budgets of universities go on but this money goes on services and on goods. So that's why we believe that procurement, beyond being a mere technical tool, it can be looked at as a very important steering instrument that would allow for the sustainability and greening agendas to be streamlined and embedded into the strategies of universities. How this can be concretely done? Well, in the first place, by moving from a lower bidder principle to an enhanced value principle that considers environmental and social criteria when purchasing assets and services on behalf of the university. And we have seen this changing trend in the past years at universities in Europe. So from this point of view, we are slowly getting there. And the last dimension that I would like us to reflect a bit upon and what it means for greening and sustainability is the role of leadership and governance. You would see that 50% of the respondents to the survey that we conducted last year said that central leadership plays an important role in advancing greening and sustainability at their respective universities. By no means this is to say that academic staff, administrative staff, and students do not equally play a very important role. And my colleague Henriette already mentioned this. It is only to say that you really need the senior managers and the senior leaders at universities to commit themselves to a greening agenda. They are needed in order to have a vision that includes greening and sustainability, that there is a strategy that includes greening and sustainability, but also in terms of implementation, that there is that there are adequate resources, both financial and in terms of also human resources, that would be committed to advancing the greening agenda at their respective universities. The results of the survey show that also what is beneficial is to have a specific portfolio in the leadership team that would exclusively tackle greening and sustainability. And in some systems, like for instance in France, we have seen that there are more and more portfolios for vice rectors on greening and sustainability. There was a recent survey conducted by colleagues from Newstank that I think they surveyed about 70 French higher education institutions, out of which almost half had a vice rector for greening and sustainability. The challenge, of course, remains that greening and sustainability is a major disruptive transformation project in higher education, and we need people and we need leaders that are prepared and who are well equipped to undertake this disruptive transformation. And from a project that my colleague Thomas already mentioned, New Lead, we found out that again, through a Europe-wide survey, that leadership development opportunities for senior leaders in higher education remain very scarce in Europe. So I think that in parallel with thinking about greening and sustainability, we also should think about investing in our leaders at higher education institutions and in the stakeholders that would have to handle greening and sustainability. So that was my final remark, but of course we are very open for questions.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for showing this additional angle to the topic. So I hope this first tour through the data that we've collected and how we linked it to some of our other work already give you an impression of where universities are active, but also, on the other hand, where are the challenges and opportunities. And I would like to encourage you now to also use the Q&A function of this webinar. Please put some of your questions into the Q&A session, and we will then try and respond to them. If we start now, Henriette, one element that you mentioned, and I linked this to a question that already popped up in relation to some specific examples of how universities, what they do. I think virtual mobility, this is something that is comes across in many different constellations. We have it when we discuss the European University Alliances. Wherever you go, this is a topic. So could you say something on that? How universities are? I mean, you showed already some statistics, but could you say a bit more about what are the challenges and opportunities around there, and specifically how universities engage in that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, virtual mobility is a topic that easily comes to mind when we talk about greening at higher education institutions, or when we talk to universities about this topic. It very easily, makes the switch to chatting who travels where and when and how long and what means do they use and do you monitor it and so on and so forth. And I think there are clear arguments for virtual mobility, or for virtual formats of mobility, but also meetings, project meetings, events, and webinars such as the one that we have today, because of course they do reduce travel costs, they reduce the carbon footprint and so on. However, on the other hand, we should not forget that also virtual modes of collaboration do have a carbon footprint, however, comparatively perhaps smaller. I think one of the main challenges is linked to virtual mobility of students, particularly of students. Of course, we all know the benefits of mobility of students traveling to another country and taking a course or a term at another university. They're linked around the development of personal skills and competencies, intercultural skills, particularly informal and non-formal learning, the things like learning about academic and professional cultures in another country, and so on. And of course, these kind of competencies and skills, they come from an immersion in a different academic culture or in a different culture overall. So therefore, I think we at EUA would agree with other stakeholder organizations such as the student unions, but also research that has been done for the European Parliament when saying that virtual mobility for students at least cannot completely replace physical mobility, and it should not. I think there's still merit for virtual or blended modes of even student mobility, perhaps, for instance, to prepare a physical mobility, or, to partner up in a more of a project style or workshop style activity as part of one of their modules that they're studying. But again, I would like to underline physical mobility should at least in some form stay on. This is the student side. When we think about researchers or university staff, the question becomes a bit more tricky. I think in the end of the day, perhaps it should be up to every researcher and member of staff to decide whether, and to carefully decide whether it is really useful to travel to a meeting or an event in person or participate in mobility in person. But overall, I think I can conclude that when we talk about environmental sustainability, we do need to take a holistic approach and not just focus on mobility. There has been some quite nice research done in the last couple of months and years on the carbon footprint of universities. One good example would come from Alea, for instance, that really shows that, of course, mobility of staff and students has a significant carbon footprint, but so does the energy consumption of universities, particularly when we look into research labs. The consumption also and the footprint also in relation to very often old infrastructure of universities. So, one has to really weigh this out and take a holistic approach when addressing it with a university strategy. And Thomas, if I can have one last point, as the question asks for a very specific example from one of the universities, one that is frequently cited and I really enjoy it, is from a Belgian university. This is about mobility of their staff. And actually this university decided or developed a system together with their staff. I need to underline this. This was signed off by them, that they monitor the carbon footprint of all the staff's travel, so to events or to project meetings. And then on a, quarterly or biannual basis, they actually receive a bill to offset the carbon footprint. And I need to underline, this is a personalized bill. So this does not run under project budgets or something. This is something they have to pay out of their own pocket. It's an interesting example because it raises awareness of how much carbon footprint, or usage of carbon they have when they travel, and it might actually nudge staff to consider taking the hybrid option the next time around. This is one of the examples from the UNESCO Little Green Book of Nudges, or Little Book of Green Nudges. There are many more interesting ones that you can find in the UNESCO publication, but of course also our report has a lot of different examples from our universities as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henriette, for also giving some of these examples. And indeed, you will find more in the reports. Here we can only touch some of them. But I think it's also important to underline, and as you already said, Henriette, it's not just one very concrete activity or area that you need to look at. It's sort of how things are connected, and that makes it in the end very challenging to make the transition from the strategies that you have to the implementation. So that's why we believe very strongly in that the good examples that you can find across Europe and also with our products should inspire others, but the importance is really to have a holistic strategy. And if I may ask the question to Luisa, as you already mentioned, this is a huge challenge for leaders who are then actually needing to provide the vision, but also ensure that this is implemented. So could you share some insights from the New Lead project in relation to that? What are the challenges in terms of implementation for university leaders?
Yes, thank you, Thomas. So within the New Lead, I mean, the main purpose of the New Lead project, in which EUA is a partner, is to develop the capacity building of university leaders to address major transformations in higher education. And so far we have been focusing on three main topics or major challenges. One of them being greening and sustainability at universities. We have already conducted a focus group in this sense, and the second one will follow beginning of June. We realized that by discussing the topic and the challenges with higher education leaders, most of them, an overwhelming majority, told us that, well, they had to they didn't benefit from any leadership development programs, that there was nothing out there for them to in terms of learning. So they kind of grew into their roles, although they might have benefited from a fully fledged leadership development program. And our research with the New Lead shows that, as I briefly touched upon before, that in Europe there is a scarcity of leadership development programs, especially for top leadership at universities. What you mostly have in terms of capacity building are soft mechanisms such as peer learning at national and European levels, or thematic peer groups, or networking opportunities. The challenges, just to quickly say something about it. So we heard funding again, especially when it comes to greening and sustainability, not having earmarked funding at the national level dedicated for this topic, not knowing very often how to access European funding for this specific topic. What are the programs that they could use in order to attract such funding? And I'm mentioning this because I've seen one of the questions precisely pointed to this: what are the programs that at the European level that could be used? But then also more transversal universal challenges, how to handle this disruptive transformation, how to communicate, how not with the other stakeholders at your university, how to get a buy-in of the entire university community around the change project, especially when there are other simultaneous and sometimes more pressing challenges. So again, linking it to a previous question, yes, there needs to be a sense of urgency that sometimes it's not there, and then you would need some external incentives to nurture this sense of urgency.
Thank you, Luisa, also for already taking up some of the questions that came up in the chat. Maybe Henriette, if you want to respond as well to some of the questions that came up, particularly the ones, is there enough sense of urgency? Mind shift, does it need to come from EU and national governments? What's your take on that, Henriette?
Thanks, Thomas. Interesting question. I think with regards to sense of urgency, it's a difficult to ask question, but if we look at the data side of things and what universities aim to achieve with their greening strategies and activities, besides, of course, reducing their carbon footprint, I think you can see that the sense of urgency comes perhaps from the demands of the student body. I'm turning around there one of the survey results that we had there, because when it came to expectations of universities on whether this would help them recruit students and staff in the future, their green credentials. So perhaps they do see a bit of a push there from stakeholders across the higher education institutions, but of course also stakeholders amongst their networks of partnerships, be it in their own environment, in their own region, but also internationally. A push coming from EU and national governments. When it comes to the side of the EU, perhaps I can go a bit beyond the funding programs that Luisa has just mentioned. Indeed, there have been some activities and policy communications recently from the EU level that link to environmental sustainability at higher education institutions. I think most recently and most directly related is the proposal for a council recommendation on education for environmental sustainability. I will share the link for this in a moment after my intervention. It's an interesting document that outlines a number of steps related to this topic for higher education institutions. However, from our end, at least quite surprisingly, very, very focused on the areas of learning and teaching. And this is then also reflected in other programs and activities of the EU when it comes to higher education and environmental sustainability. So to give you a couple of examples here, you know that our Horizon funding, a lot of Horizon funding is packed to fund projects that are linked to achieving the goals of the Green Deal. There's this so-called Msca Green Charter, which focuses on the reduction of the environmental footprint of research labs and all research carried out under Msca. Very interesting aspirational document, but perhaps in the future this will also apply to other research programs. Then more directly linked to learning and teaching, EU has established an Education for Climate Coalition, which brings together people from different sectors, education sectors from primary to higher education, to really work on bringing in environmental sustainability into curricula, into learning and teaching activities. They're very concrete projects, and I invite you to have a look at this one. And last but not least, there's of course the Erasmus Plus program. Now, this one has environmental sustainability as an overarching priority. We see it reflected in the projects that the program will fund in the current cycle, but we also see it reflected in first steps towards, addressing questions around physical mobility. So there are top-ups now for students, at the moment only for students, but perhaps in the future also staff that take green modes of transport, so train over plane, so to say. They also consider monitoring and offsetting in the future, but this is all still in the thought stage. So yes, I mean, there are definitely things where the policy levels try to nudge, at least from the European side. And Luisa already mentioned the perhaps most concrete example from the national side is France. We didn't see anything as concrete in the survey data that we have gathered from other countries where there's really a national policy that relates to higher education environmental sustainability, except the French example.
Thank you very much, Henriette. Maybe also picking up the question on the funding, we still have 15 minutes left for answering the questions. Luisa, I think we already briefly mentioned the Next Generation EU funding package and how this funding instrument is clearly linked to the green transition, and as we have been looking at this as well, could you give some insights on that, where some countries are doing something well? Because this is also one question in the chat, if there are any leaders in the green transition. I mean, this would be a very specific take on this, but I think we've seen also some examples of how some systems maybe use these funding programs better than others.
Yes, as you said, Thomas, from this very perspective, which is of course an angle, there are some countries that score better than others, but only in the sense that we have some European member states that included greening their public universities into their national recovery and resilience plans that they submitted to the European Commission for approval in the course of last year. So one of these countries is Belgium. The system committed to invest 50 million euros in the energy retrofitting of old buildings of universities in the Brussels, Wallonia part of the country. We also have France, because you mentioned France, as Henriette, that also has a national legislation, if I remember well, on greening and sustainability. So in terms of higher education, among the few countries where you can really find legislation on this at the national level on this topic. So France also committed to invest money into the university buildings, into adapting them to make them more energy efficient. And then a third example would be Cyprus, that also foreseen money in its national recovery and resilience plan for developing a smart grid infrastructure at the University of Cyprus. So these are just three examples. Of course, there are more, but these are three that I wanted to highlight. And if I may, Thomas, because I know that I just looked through the chat and I see that colleagues would like to have a bit also more concrete, not necessarily information, but also examples on what universities are doing in terms of greening and sustainability. And during my presentation, I have not really mentioned concrete examples. I just want to say that, for instance, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, there are just two that stayed with me and that I want to just bring them forward, if I may, of course. There is a joint logistics hub that was launched by the University of Amsterdam and the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. So what is happening is that they are placing orders and jointly, and then you have companies that deliver the orders jointly for the two universities at the outskirts of Amsterdam, Amsterdam itself being a very busy city. So from there on, so you have this joint logistics until the outskirts of Amsterdam, and then only from there on, you have the two universities that come and pick their orders, and this saves time and this saves costs. And another example, still in terms of efficiency, that are created by greening initiatives, it's from the University of Copenhagen. Another example that stayed with me is being the very fact that just by increasing the freezer temperature with a couple of degrees, you get to have major energy savings without jeopardizing your research. So there are more examples out there in our report, but just to that I also wanted to highlight.
Thank you very much, Luisa, and also to highlight that in the chat, and thanks to Henriette and Luisa for already sharing the links to the some of the documents that you have mentioned. So everyone, please also have a look there in the chat. You will find the link to those publications, where you then also find more examples. There are a couple of questions. I think we have to make a selection now for the last 10 minutes what we take up. One is on how to upscale and include the university community with when it's highly complex. And I think that is a question that we have seen, Luisa, also newly in the focus groups, the discussions, that actually it's not only the green transition that universities have to deal with, but with many other major transformation challenges. And I'm connecting a couple of questions here, but indeed, how can universities sort of ensure that with all the many different transformation topics, with all the many different challenges, this one stays relevant and gets implemented? What kind of recommendations could you give to our community that's listening?
I just scribbled down some things now from our conversations, very meaningful conversations that we had with university leaders, but I mean from across Europe on how to tackle change management in higher education, especially the post-pandemic, so not just dwelling only on COVID-19. And there were several things that were reflected upon. So one was not to be too disruptive at once. So change takes time and resistance is normal. And that's why it is good to bring change step by step, not everything at once, not necessarily to push it through at a very fast pace. That will not work. Have a clear communication around the change project. That's very important. And consult with all stakeholders, academic, administrative staff, students, a priori, so upstream. That's very important. Try if you manage change to have an open door policy to the extent possible, listening into people and their concerns. And also something that I remember from our conversations as being very powerful is to have a hope-based leadership. So having hope and being optimistic. It might sound trite, but you know, if you think about it, it is not. So trying to stay optimistic and really celebrate the small wins. That's very important. I'm not sure, Thomas, if perhaps you have others in mind as well.
No, I think that's already quite fine, and maybe also the reference that you made, Luisa, to the leadership of hope. This is also, we have also an expert voice just published recently on that topic, which we find also very interesting on leadership theory. That's based on the philosophy of Ernst Bloch. So certainly, if you want to go to our website, but we maybe also share it in the chat, because I think that really gives quite some indications also how to tackle this topic from the leadership angle. Henriette, do you want to add something to this section, or shall we just move on to some of the other questions that are in there? I'm just seeing also one question that asks more about, well, what within this sort of full portfolio that you can look at greening, if there's a focus, or might there be a focus just too much on climate, but how do you manage to look at other aspects as well? Any takes on that?
Sorry, I did not see this question. It's too much focus on climate research and not on other aspects. Is that correct? Did I get that correctly? Sorry, Thomas.
No, sorry. No, that was the question is there a sort of themes within greening are co-focus areas for higher educations with sort of the assumption that there must be a risk that is reduced to climate, but other topics would also be very important within the whole frame of greening and sustainability.
Okay, sorry, I get it now. Thank you for reiterating it. Actually, I don't particularly think so, especially when looking at the different areas and missions that universities use as a vehicle to address environmental sustainability. So, for instance, in the area of learning and teaching, in terms of, examples, of course, there's aspects about raising awareness of climate change and so on. But there is also very specific focus depending on this field of study or the course on various specific aspects such as listed here in this question. I see it now like biodiversity, for instance. And I think the slides of Luisa also have shown that when it comes, for instance, to resource consumption, all these questions around procurement, they're really big in the minds of universities at the moment. And we see really a lot of examples coming from procurement in the largest sense of infrastructure down to the smallest sense even. So like switching the canteens to local food and doing 5 days a week vegan or vegetarian, those are very small steps that universities take, but they are definitely varied.
Thank you, Henriette. Indeed, this is a link to that question. Maybe one more that you could take up. I'm just scanning through. There was one question that referred to might the lack of gender equality measures may impede or disadvantage higher education institutions for applying for grants. Do you foresee similar measures for environmental sustainability? So the link to gender equality or equality in a broader sense. Tricky question.
Yes, it's a tricky question, but a really good one. I hope the way that I understand it, what the colleague means is that at application stage, universities need to show that they have gender equality plans in place. Otherwise, they get a deduction of points. And yes, I do see something like this, perhaps also in the future when it comes to universities having greening plans in place. And we already kind of see it, perhaps not in such a detrimental way that you lose out on grant funding, but we do see it already in place in the new Erasmus Charter. This is this charter that all universities need to sign when they want to receive Erasmus Plus funding for student mobility, but also for projects. The new charter actually makes reference and asks signatory universities to address environmental sustainability, of course, particularly in relation to the actions of Erasmus Plus, such as mobility, and also asked the universities to have an officer in place dealing with these questions related to environmental sustainability of their internationalization. And I mentioned previously the MSCA Green Charter. I think this is a really interesting document. It kind of an aspirational document. Everyone who receives funding from MSCA, be it a university, a research team, or an individual research fellow, because MSCA funding is very often fellowships, basically sign up to this document and say that they will do their best, so to say, to reduce the environmental footprint of their research, recycle, reuse, and so on. But also when it comes to the individual level, it actually asks individual researchers to try and sort of nudge their university towards implementing steps in this area. Now, at the moment, this is a rather new document. At the moment, it is as I said, there's nothing compulsory about it. There will be some sort of reporting at the end of a project or a fellowship where grantees will be asked to report on green aspects of their project or their fellowship. And this will be at this point in time. However, in the discussions within MSCA and the research unit, we do know that the plans are to make this perhaps in the future more of a compulsory feature, that researchers or institutions that receive funding under this program perhaps would already have to write something or would even get points for aspects of reducing environmental footprint of their research at the application stage, that there would be stronger reporting and so on. But this is something that they would only introduce in the next funding cycle. So what is it, in 5 years time from now on? And I do see potential anyway for this Green Charter to move to other research programs such as Horizon in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much, Henriette. I'm afraid we're coming to the end. As always, I would say we could have continued the exchange and discussions, which I believe is also a sign of the interest in this topic. I hope that this hour gave you an overview and an insight and the mix between the bigger picture, European policies, strategies, but also including some examples how universities are dealing with that issue, how university leaders tackle some of these challenges. And please stay in touch with us on that topic. It's certainly something that EUA is going to continue to work on. And you have the links to the documents that we shared. The presentations, you will get these documents, and of course you can get in touch with us if you have any further questions or also ideas of how to take this topic further. Thank you very much to Henriette and Luisa, and thank you very much for attending this webinar, and also for your very active interaction in the chat and the Q&A, and hope we see some of you very soon in one of our next events. Thank you very much and goodbye.